At my daughter's wedding, the man she was about to marry smirked, pointed his champagne flute at me, and introduced me to his billionaire boss as an unemployed loser who was just there for the free food. His boss, a man who terrified everyone in the financial district, slowly turned around, looked at me, went dead pale, and said to the groom, "You are fired." What that arrogant boy didn't realize was that I wasn't just some broke retiree. I was the silent owner of the private equity firm that had just bought his entire corporate existence. If you are watching this, take a deep breath. Sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones holding the keys to your destruction. Hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. The crystal chandeliers of Le Bernardin cast a cold, sharp light over the private dining room. It was the kind of place where a single steak cost more than what most families spent on groceries in an entire month. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table wearing a faded gray flannel shirt and a sports coat that had seen better decades. I could feel the eyes on me, the judgmental, piercing stares of Trent Lawson's friends and colleagues. They were all wearing bespoke Tom Ford suits, flashing heavy Rolex watches, and laughing with that particular brand of arrogance that only comes from inherited wealth and unearned confidence. I am Harrison Cole. I am 70 years old. To the people in this room, I was just Madeline's embarrassing blue-collar father. An old relic who drove a sputtering 1998 Ford F-150 and lived on a meager pension. That was the story I let them believe. That was the story I let everyone believe. Trent sat at the head of the table, his arm draped possessively over my daughter's chair. My Madeline. She looked radiant, wearing a simple silk dress and the delicate pearl necklace that belonged to her mother, Kathy. Seeing that necklace brought a familiar heavy ache to my chest. Kathy passed away 5 years ago, and on her deathbed, holding my hand with the last of her strength, she made me promise one thing. Protect her smile, Harrison. No matter what it takes, keep our girl smiling. That promise was the only thing keeping me in my seat. It was the only thing keeping me from reaching across the table and breaking Trent's perfectly sculpted jaw. The evening had been a masterclass in passive-aggressive humiliation. Trent had insisted on hosting this engagement dinner at the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan, knowing full well I lived a quiet life in the suburbs. When I pulled up to the valet in my battered truck, Trent and his groomsmen had been standing outside smoking cigars. He didn't greet me. He just laughed loud enough for me to hear and told the valet to park the junker in the alley so it wouldn't ruin the aesthetic of the entrance. Inside, he made sure I was seated at the very end of the table, flanked by 2 of his junior analysts who barely acknowledged my existence. Every time Madeline tried to bring me into the conversation, Trent would smoothly cut her off, redirecting the attention back to his recent promotions, his golf handicap, and his brilliant future at Apex Solutions. Then came the wine. A sommelier approached the table presenting a bottle of vintage Bordeaux that I knew cost upwards of $3,000. Trent nodded approvingly, allowing the man to pour for his friends. But when the sommelier moved toward my end of the table, Trent held up a hand. "Wait a second," Francois Trent said, his voice carrying easily over the soft jazz playing in the background. "Don't waste the good stuff on the far end. My father-in-law here isn't used to vintage. Bring him a glass of the house red. The cheap stuff. We don't want the unemployed retiree to spill it and have a panic attack over the cost." The table erupted into a chorus of sycophantic laughter. The junior analysts next to me snickered, swirling their expensive wine. Madeline's face flushed crimson. She started to stand up, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Trent, that is completely uncalled for." "Dad, I am so sorry." "Maddie, babe, relax," Trent interrupted, flashing her a condescending smile. "It's a joke. Right, Bill? Just a joke between men. I just know your dad is on a fixed income. I'm looking out for his blood pressure. He didn't even use my real name. He called me Bill because he couldn't be bothered to remember Harrison." Underneath the heavy linen tablecloth, my hands curled into tight fists. I gripped my silver fork so hard, the metal dug deep into my skin. I traced the rough, thick calluses on my palms, calluses earned from 40 years of grinding, building, and surviving. Trent saw those hands and saw a laborer. He saw a man who had been defeated by the world. He didn't know that those same hands had built Vanguard Capital from the ground up. He didn't know that the worn flannel shirt I wore was a personal choice, a rejection of the superficial corporate uniform he worshipped. He didn't know that my net worth could buy this entire restaurant, bulldoze it, and build a parking lot just for my old Ford truck without making a single dent in my accounts. I looked at Madeline. Her eyes were bright, with unshed tears, caught between her loyalty to me and her desperation to make this dinner work. She touched her mother's pearl necklace, a nervous habit she'd had since she was a little girl. "Protect her smile, Harrison." Kathy's voice echoed in my mind, anchoring me. If I unleashed my reality right now, if I destroyed Trent in front of his friends, I would ruin Madeline's night. I would be the villain who ruined her engagement. I couldn't do that to her. Not yet. So I let the anger simmer. I pushed it down, burying it deep in my gut, where it turned into something cold, heavy, and infinitely more dangerous. I slowly released my grip on the fork. I looked up at the sommelier, who was standing awkwardly unsure of what to do. I gave him a polite, dismissive nod. "The house red is fine, thank you. Water will do just as well." Trent smirked, raising his glass toward me in a mock salute. "See, he knows his limits. A man has to know his place in the world." I met Trent's eyes across the length of the table. I didn't scowl. I didn't shout. I just stared at him with a dead, hollow calm. A chill seemed to pass through the room, and for a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of unease crack his arrogant facade. He quickly looked away, turning back to his friends, to loudly recount a story about his latest stock trade. I sat back in my chair, taking a slow sip of the ice water. "You think you hold all the cards, Trent. You think you are the master of the universe because you wear a fancy suit and lease an expensive car. You think I am just a clueless, broken-down old man waiting to die. Let him believe it. Let him dig his grave as deep as he possibly can. In my 35 years navigating the vicious, cutthroat world of private equity, I learned one absolute truth. The most lethal strike is the one your enemy never sees coming. I wasn't going to ruin a simple dinner. When the time came, I was going to dismantle his entire existence. But as the night wore on, a dark, unsettling feeling began to take root in my stomach. The disrespect was one thing. Arrogance I could handle. But there was a desperation in Trent's eyes when he talked about money. A frantic, hungry energy that didn't match the image of a successful executive. My gut, honed by decades of sniffing out corporate fraud and liars, started blaring warning sirens. This man wasn't just an arrogant prick. He was hiding something massive, and he was using my daughter as a shield. I didn't know what it was yet, but as I watched him excuse himself from the table, leaning in and aggressively whispering into his phone with his eyes darting nervously toward the exit, I swore to myself that I would tear his life apart piece by piece to find out. A week passed before the first real crack in his polished armor appeared, not in a dark alley, but right on my daughter's pristine quartz kitchen counter. I was lying on my back on the cold tile floor of Madeline's kitchen, a heavy wrench gripped tightly in my right hand as I carefully tightened a leaking copper pipe under her sink. It was exactly the kind of gritty manual labor I always insisted on doing myself. To Madeline, it was just her handy working-class dad trying to save her a very expensive plumber's fee. To me, it was a way to stay close to her, to protect the quiet sanctuary I had secretly built for her. When Kathy passed, I used an anonymous dummy corporation to purchase this beautiful 3-bedroom suburban home, completely paid off in cash, and transferred the deed to Madeline as an anonymous graduation gift. She thought she had won a miraculous local lottery scholarship. She had no idea the invisible, powerful hand of Pinnacle Holdings had orchestrated the entire thing to keep her safe. While I was meticulously adjusting the pipe joint, I heard the sudden heavy thud of a massive document being dropped onto the kitchen island directly above me. I paused immediately, holding my breath to listen. I heard Trent's slick, highly rehearsed voice echoing smoothly through the open kitchen. He told Madeline it was just some standard boring boilerplate paperwork, a basic prenuptial agreement His conservative firm required all top executives to have on file before any legal marriage. He kissed her cheek softly, told her absolutely not to worry about reading the boring legal jargon, and cheerfully said he needed to go organize his expensive golf clubs out in the garage. I heard Madeline sigh softly, the quiet flutter of thick pages turning, and then the loud ringing of her cell phone. She answered, warmly greeted a young patient from her busy pediatric ward, and slowly walked out to the sunny back patio. The large kitchen was completely silent. I slid out from under the dark sink, slowly wiping the dark grease and old grime from my deeply calloused hands onto a torn rag. I stood up straight and looked down at the expensive kitchen island. There it lay, a remarkably thick, professionally bound stack of legal papers exactly 40 pages long. I certainly did not need a law degree to read and analyze it. I have personally orchestrated hostile, highly complex takeovers of international Fortune 500 companies that required significantly less paperwork than this single document. I quickly flipped past the standard predictable asset protection clauses directly to the real estate and property section. It did not take very long for my trained eyes to find the hidden poison pill. It was buried deep on page 27, carefully masked, behind thick layers of dense, convoluted financial terminology, specifically designed to confuse a layman. But I am not a layman. The terrible clause mandated that upon their marriage, the primary residence currently solely owned by Madeline must be immediately transferred into a joint irrevocable property trust, and who was listed as the sole managing trustee with absolute unquestionable authority to liquidate secretly, borrow against, or entirely sell the asset Trent Lawson. My hot blood turned to absolute ice. This was definitely not a standard prenuptial agreement designed to protect pre-existing assets from a messy divorce. This was a highly calculated, utterly predatory transfer of generational wealth. He was actively planning to legally steal my daughter's beautiful home. The secure home I bought to ensure she would never have to worry about a roof over her head if the harsh world ever turned cruel. Trent was not just an arrogant corporate climber seeking a trophy wife. He was a ruthless, calculating thief. I gripped the thick page so tightly, the crisp paper violently crumpled under my rough fingers. I very carefully tore that single damning page from the tight binding, folded it neatly into the front pocket of my faded red flannel shirt, and walked deliberately toward the heavy door leading to the garage. Trent was happily humming a cheerful tune, carefully wiping down the shining hood of his leased silver Audi with a soft microfiber cloth. He looked up quickly as I entered the garage, the highly familiar smirk of utter disdain instantly crawling onto his handsome face. He looked down at my grease-stained hands and sighed dramatically loudly, asking if I had finally managed to fix a very simple leak or if he urgently needed to call a real professional to handle it. I did not raise my voice at all. I did not show any outward anger. I simply pulled the crumpled legal page from my front pocket, stepped aggressively forward, and placed it completely flat on the pristine hood of his expensive car. I calmly asked him to explain Clause 4, subsection B. Trent stopped wiping the car immediately. He looked down at the paper, then slowly looked back at me. There was absolutely no panic in his dark eyes. There was no visible guilt. Instead, he let out an incredibly soft, deeply patronizing chuckle. He picked up the paper, smoothed out the deep wrinkles, and casually leaned against his car, crossing his strong arms. He looked at me exactly the way one might look at a confused, remarkably slow-witted child. He told me to calm down and take a deep breath. He said, "Bill, you are from an older, much simpler generation. You spent your entire life working hard with your bare hands, and there is definite dignity in that, but you do not understand how modern wealth actually works. In the modern corporate world, this is exactly how we build long-lasting generational wealth. I work in high finance. I manage massive portfolios worth millions. I know exactly how to double the equity of this house for Maddie's bright future. By placing it in a trust under my expert management, I can brilliantly leverage the asset to secure high-yield investments. Do not stress your tired old head over complex legal jargon you cannot possibly comprehend. "It is just business, Bill." The sheer audacity of his smooth lie was almost genuinely impressive. He was staring directly into the cold eyes of a man who successfully manipulated global financial markets before he was even born, arrogantly lecturing me on basic asset leveraging as a convenient smokescreen for outright theft. He was actively trying to gaslight me heavily, using my assumed poverty and total lack of formal education as a psychological weapon to make me seriously doubt my own basic reading comprehension. He stepped slightly closer, his voice dropping to a low, incredibly conspiratorial whisper. He smugly told me that Madeline desperately needed a strong man who could adequately provide for her, a capable man who truly understood the harsh, unforgiving realities of the modern economy, unlike a retired, broken-down handyman who struggled to pay for his own weekly groceries. He gently suggested that if I truly loved my only daughter, I would quietly step aside and let a real man secure her entire financial future. Then the kitchen door opened, and my daughter suddenly stepped right outside. Trent's demeanor transformed in a fraction of a second. The cold, calculating predator vanished instantly, replaced by the warm, adoring fiancé. He snatched the crumpled piece of paper from the hood of the car, slipped it smoothly into his tailored slacks, and walked toward her with his arms wide open. "Maddie, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with fabricated affection. "Your father and I were just having a wonderful talk about our future." Madeline smiled, her eyes darting between the two of us. She looked so genuinely happy, so blissfully unaware of the venomous snake standing right in her own garage. I forced my jaw to unclamp. I wiped my hands on my jeans and gave her the best reassuring nod I could muster. I told her we were just discussing the plumbing. Trent laughed, a rich, hearty sound that made my stomach churn with absolute disgust. He wrapped his arm around her waist and guided her back toward the kitchen, tossing a brief, triumphant glare over his shoulder. It was a silent challenge, a daring invitation for me to ruin her happiness by speaking up. I remained silent. I knew better than to strike when the enemy was prepared. Later that evening, after a tense dinner where Trent played the perfect host, I initiated the next phase of my strategy. I packed up my heavy toolbox, but let out a long, weary sigh. I rubbed my lower back, playing the part of the exhausted laborer. I told Madeline that the master valve on the main water line was severely corroded. I explained that I needed to completely replace the fitting, but the sealant required at least 24 hours to properly cure. I casually mentioned that it would be best if I stayed over for a few nights, just to monitor the water pressure and ensure the pipes did not burst and ruin her beautiful hardwood floors. Madeline, ever the compassionate nurse, immediately insisted I take the guest bedroom. Trent's smile tightened slightly, but he could not object without looking entirely unreasonable. I declined the bedroom, insisting the living room couch was closer to the kitchen pipes and perfectly fine for an old man with a bad back. I wanted to be on this ground floor. I wanted to be right in the center of the house, positioned perfectly outside the hallway that led to Trent's private home office. For the first 2 nights, nothing happened. Trent went to work early and came home late, playing the part of the dedicated financial vice president. Madeline worked her long shifts at the pediatric ward, exhausted, but glowing with wedding anticipation. I spent my days meticulously checking the pipes, maintaining my cover, while my mind constantly analyzed the single torn page of the prenuptial agreement safely hidden in my truck. But on the 3rd night, the facade finally cracked. It was 2:00 in the morning. The suburban neighborhood was buried in absolute silence. Madeline had gone to sleep hours ago, her soft breathing barely audible from the master suite upstairs. I was lying wide awake on the uncomfortable floral sofa, wrapped in a thin wool blanket, staring up at the dark ceiling. My senses were heightened, tuned to the subtle creaks and groans of the house. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a heavy oak door clicking shut, followed by the metallic sliding of a deadbolt turning into place. It came from Trent's office down the hall. I threw off the blanket and placed my bare feet silently onto the cold floorboards. I did not turn on any lights. I moved through the darkness with the practiced stealth of a man who had survived far worse environments than a luxury suburban home. I crept down the narrow hallway, pressing my back flat against the smooth painted drywall right next to the office door. The walls in these modern development homes were notoriously thin. They looked expensive, but they lacked real substance, much like the man currently locked inside that room. I pressed my ear against the cool plaster and controlled my breathing. Inside the room, Trent was pacing frantically. I could hear his leather slippers scuffing aggressively back and forth across the hardwood. He was breathing heavily, ragged and uneven. Then he spoke. His voice was no longer the smooth, confident baritone he used to charm my daughter or command a boardroom. It was a desperate, shaking hiss. He was not talking about hedge funds, mutual portfolios, or offshore asset allocation. He was begging. "Listen to me," he whispered frantically. "I just need an extension. 14 days. That is all I am asking for. You know I am good for it." I heard a muffled, low voice responding from the other end of the line. Trent stopped pacing. His breathing hitched. "You do not need to send anyone to my house again," he pleaded, his voice cracking with genuine terror. "I saw your guys. I got the message. Please leave Madeline out of this. She does not know anything. Just give me until the 14th. The wedding is on the 12th. Once the marriage certificate is legally filed, the house trust is mine. I will sign the collateral over to you immediately. You can have the whole property. Do not touch my kneecaps. I cannot negotiate the apex deal if I am in a hospital bed. I just need the house collateral by the 14th. I swear to God, you will get every single penny." The line went dead. I heard the heavy thud of a cell phone being thrown violently against the wooden desk. Trent let out a pathetic, suffocated sob, a sound so utterly weak and broken, it completely shattered the polished illusion he presented to the world. He was not a sophisticated financial genius, navigating the complexities of modern wealth generation. He was a desperate, drowning rat. He borrowed money from people who did not sign legal contracts, people who operated in the shadows, people who broke bones and collected debts in blood. I stood frozen in the dark hallway, the cold reality of the situation washing over me like ice water. My gut feeling had been absolutely right. The prenuptial agreement was not about protecting his non-existent assets from a potential divorce. It was a calculated predatory mechanism designed specifically to steal my daughter's property to save his own miserable life. He was actively planning to feed her home to a criminal syndicate just to keep his own kneecaps intact. The anger flaring inside my chest was no longer the quiet, simmering resentment of an insulted father. It was a cold, absolute, and terrifying rage. This man had brought severe, life-threatening danger directly to Madeline's doorstep. He had dragged the criminal underworld into the safe sanctuary I had built for her. I pushed myself away from the wall, silently walking back to the living room couch. I lay down slowly, in the total darkness of the silent house, my eyes wide open, staring intensely at the shifting shadows dancing across the living room ceiling. The time for playing the foolish, unemployed old man was over. Tomorrow, I was going to war. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen blinds. I sat at the breakfast island with my coffee, watching Trent pour a glass of juice. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, he hummed a cheerful melody, as if the desperate phone call from the night before had never happened. Madeline rushed around the kitchen in her blue medical scrubs, packing lunch for her shift at the pediatric ward. She stopped to kiss my cheek, her smile completely untainted by the dark reality closing in around her. She told me to take it easy today and rest my bad back on the couch. I promised her I would be careful and watched her walk out to her car. Trent finished his juice, flashed a patronizing grin, and told me not to break anything while he was making real money. I nodded silently, gripping my mug. I watched from the window as he drove away. The house fell completely silent. I spent the next few hours inspecting the property, my mind racing with cold calculations. I needed concrete evidence. Shortly past 2 in the afternoon, the quiet suburban street was violently disrupted. I was kneeling on the porch, tightening loose screws on a wooden railing, playing the part of the diligent father. The neighborhood was entirely peaceful. Then a black SUV with heavily tinted windows rolled slowly down the street. It crept along the curb like a predatory animal before abruptly pulling into the pristine driveway. The engine idled with a deep rumble. The doors opened. Two men stepped out. They were enormous, wearing cheap dark suits that stretched tightly across their broad shoulders. They did not walk toward the door. Instead, they sauntered directly onto the manicured green lawn, their heavy boots crushing the grass. One of them lit a cigarette and blew a thick cloud of smoke toward the front window. They just stood there, staring menacingly silently, projecting an aura of absolute violence. My grip tightened around the heavy steel wrench. The metal felt cold against my palm. I stood up slowly, my eyes locked on the intruders. I did not care how big they were. This was the home of my daughter, and no one brought a threat here without answering to me. I took a deliberate step down the stairs, ready to use the tool in my hand to break their kneecaps. Before my boot could touch the pavement, the front door violently slammed open behind me. Trent burst onto the porch. He had supposedly gone to the office, but clearly he had returned in secret. His face was drained of color, covered in cold sweat. He ignored me rushing past and practically leaping down the stairs. He ran toward the men, raising his hands in a frantic gesture of surrender. I stopped on the bottom step, watching the scene unfold with calculating eyes. Trent pushed his hands against the smoking man, aggressively whispering in a panicked tone. I could not make out the words, but the sheer terror radiating from his posture was unmistakable. He pointed down the street, begging them to leave, pushing them toward the vehicle. The smoking man took another slow drag, looked at Trent with utter contempt, and flicked burning ash directly onto his expensive leather shoes. Trent flinched visibly, but did not retaliate. His hands trembled violently as he pulled out a thick white envelope from his jacket. He shoved it forcefully into the hand of the second man. The man squeezed the envelope, then gave a slow, dissatisfied nod to his partner. As the smoking man turned to walk back, the afternoon sun caught the side of his thick neck. My eyes locked onto the dark ink etched into his skin. It was a specific tattoo of a coiled serpent wrapping around a bloody dagger. My blood ran cold. I knew exactly what that mark meant. During my early years building Pinnacle Holdings, I had dealt with the dangerous underbelly of the city to secure my assets. That serpent tattoo was the mark of a notorious local crime syndicate, a vicious group known for predatory lending and making people disappear without a trace. These were professional enforcers, and Trent was directly on their payroll. The two men climbed back into their dark vehicle, the doors slamming shut. The vehicle reversed aggressively out of the driveway and sped off down the street, leaving a trail of dark exhaust fumes in its wake. Trent stood frozen in the middle of the driveway for several long moments. His shoulders were slumped, his chest heaving as he tried to regulate his panicked breathing. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a silk handkerchief, and wiped the heavy sweat from his pale forehead. He took a deep, shaky breath, attempting to reconstruct the arrogant, polished facade he wore like armor. He turned around slowly and began walking back toward the front porch, where I was still standing, perfectly still, the heavy steel wrench gripped tightly in my hand. As he approached the wooden steps, he forced a bright, completely artificial smile onto his face. He let out a loud, exaggerated laugh that sounded incredibly hollow in the quiet afternoon air. He looked at me, shaking his head in mock annoyance. "Aggressive life insurance salesman," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with casual frustration. "They are absolutely relentless these days. They just show up unannounced and refuse to take no for an answer. So annoying. You really have to be firm with people like that, Bill, or they will completely waste your entire afternoon." I stared directly into his dark, lying eyes. He was standing 3 feet away from a man who knew he had just handed a bribe to a violent cartel enforcer, yet he lied with the effortless grace of a true psychopath. I took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart and clenched fists. I did not blink. I did not challenge his ridiculous story. I simply nodded slowly, matching his fake, casual tone. "You certainly do have to be firm," I replied quietly. "You never know what kind of dangerous people might end up at your front door." His fake smile twitched, a brief flash of unease crossing his face before he quickly walked past me and stepped back into the house. I remained on the front porch, the cold steel of the wrench biting into my palm. He was moving money. He was paying off enforcers in broad daylight. The deadline he mentioned on the phone last night was fast approaching. If he was handing cash to syndicate thugs on her lawn, there had to be a paper trail. There had to be physical evidence of his financial desperation hidden somewhere on this property. I looked down at the neatly manicured bushes lining the side of the garage right where the large garbage bins were securely stored. My eyes narrowed sharply as a new highly calculated plan formed in my mind. I needed to dig deeper into the physical garbage he was throwing away. The truth was buried here, and I was prepared to get dirty to find it. Once the sun set, I would completely tear his world apart. The following morning arrived with a thick, suffocating humidity that clung to the suburban streets. Trent came downstairs impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, rolling a sleek leather overnight bag behind him. He flashed his perfect empty smile at Madeline, kissing her softly on the forehead while adjusting his expensive silk tie. He told her he had to fly to Boston for an emergency executive retreat, claiming his firm needed his brilliant financial mind to close a critical quarterly acquisition. He played the part of the devoted, exhausted corporate hero flawlessly. He even tossed a patronizing nod in my direction, reminding me to keep the kitchen sink dry while he was away conquering the financial world. I simply nodded, sipping my black coffee, watching him carry his luggage to the waiting black town car. Madeline waved happily from the front porch until the vehicle disappeared around the leafy corner. The moment the car was out of sight, a profound, heavy silence settled over the large house. Madeline left for a double shift at the hospital shortly after leaving me completely alone. The stage was finally set. I waited patiently for the neighborhood to quiet down, allowing the late afternoon sun to slowly dip below the tree line. As the shadows lengthened across the manicured lawn, I walked out to the side of the garage where the large municipal disposal bins were kept. Trent was a man who meticulously curated his entire life. He was obsessed with appearances, which meant he would never leave incriminating evidence lying casually around his pristine home office. If he wanted to permanently destroy something, he would do it thoroughly. I opened the heavy lid of the primary recycling bin. It was filled with broken cardboard boxes, empty wine bottles, and glossy financial magazines. Nothing out of the ordinary. I moved to the general waste bin. It smelled of stale coffee grounds and rotting vegetables. I rolled up the sleeves of my faded flannel shirt, completely ignoring the foul stench, and began pulling out the mundane debris of their daily lives. Halfway down the deep plastic barrel, my hands hit something unusual. Beneath a thick, damp layer of freshly cut grass, clippings, and decomposing yard waste, there was a heavy, tightly knotted black contractor bag. It felt completely out of place. It was dense, unnaturally heavy, and pushed deep into the bottom corner, as if someone had forcefully crammed it down to evade casual detection. I gripped the thick plastic and hauled it up onto the concrete driveway. I pulled a sharp utility knife from my leather tool belt and carefully sliced a long, precise line down the center of the dark plastic. The bag split open, spilling its contents onto the cold pavement. It was not household garbage. It was a massive mound of tightly compacted, cross-cut paper shreds. Thousands upon thousands of tiny, jagged white ribbons mixed with bits of glossy cardstock. Trent had not simply thrown his secrets away. He had fed them through a heavy-duty industrial shredder. A normal person would have looked at that insurmountable mountain of confetti, sighed in absolute defeat, and thrown it right back into the garbage bin. But I am not a normal person. I did not build a global private equity empire by walking away from impossible puzzles. I gathered the heavy bag in my arms, carried it through the side door, and dumped the entire mountain of shredded paper directly onto the center of Madeline's spacious living room rug. I turned on every single lamp in the room. I retrieved a roll of clear adhesive tape, a large pair of reading glasses, and a wide piece of dark cardboard to serve as my working canvas. I sat cross-legged on the floor and began the grueling, agonizing process of sorting the chaos. The first hour was completely maddening. My 70-year-old eyes strained against the glaring light. My lower back throbbed with a dull, relentless ache. But I refused to stop. I began separating the shreds by color, organizing the white paper from the blue ink, isolating the tiny fragments that contained numbers or distinct lettering. Midnight came and went. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 1, then 2, then 3 in the morning. My fingers were cramped and covered in sticky residue, but a distinct pattern was finally beginning to emerge on the dark cardboard. I found a corner piece with a unique red logo. I found fragments of a formal letterhead. I meticulously taped the jagged edges together, sliding the tiny pieces around like a forensic investigator reconstructing a shattered stained glass window. By 4 in the morning, the central document was mostly whole. My breath caught sharply in my chest as my exhausted eyes scanned the reconstructed text. It was a formal, highly aggressive legal document, but it was not from a standard American bank. The header displayed the emblem of a notorious high-risk offshore lending firm based in the Cayman Islands, a shadow bank known in elite financial circles for dealing exclusively with desperate clients and charging predatory, extortionate interest rates. I traced my calloused finger down to the recipient line. The bold black letters punched the air right out of my lungs. The letter was not addressed to Trent Lawson. It was addressed directly to Madeline Cole, my beautiful, hard-working daughter, who spent her long days saving sick children in a pediatric ward, was listed as the primary guarantor on a massive offshore loan. I read the terrifying numbers printed clearly in the center of the reconstructed page. $2.5 million. It was a final notice of default. The document explicitly stated that the borrower had missed 3 consecutive penalty payments and that the firm was immediately initiating hostile collection protocols. Trent had not just borrowed money from dangerous people. He had actively stolen my daughter's identity to do it. He had forged her signature, used her pristine credit, and leveraged the very house I had bought for her to secure his shadow loan. The pieces of his monstrous puzzle violently snapped together in my mind. The sudden rush to get married, the oppressive 40-page prenuptial agreement demanding total control of her property, the terrifying men with the serpent tattoos standing on her front lawn. He was going to let her take the entire fall for his catastrophic financial sins. He was literally serving her up on a silver platter to a ruthless criminal syndicate to save his own skin. I sat alone on the living room floor, surrounded by the physical evidence of my daughter's impending destruction. The quiet, gentle father who fixed leaky pipes and wore faded flannel shirts effectively died right there on that rug. The agonizing pain in my back vanished entirely, replaced by a freezing, calculated fury. I carefully folded the reconstructed document and placed it securely into my breast pocket. I stood up, my posture perfectly straight, the fatigue of the long night completely gone. Trent thought he was a brilliant predator playing a very sophisticated game with an incredibly naive family. He had no idea about the giant he had just viciously kicked tonight. I did not sleep. I sat in the dim living room until dawn crept through the blinds, the reconstructed default notice folded meticulously in my pocket. When I heard Madeline's car pull into the driveway from her night shift, I was already outside warming up the engine of my battered 1998 Ford. I greeted her with a warm smile, kissed her forehead, and told her I was heading out for plumbing supplies. She looked tired, but happy, completely unaware of the devastating storm gathering just beneath the surface of her perfect life. I pulled out of the driveway, the engine of my truck rumbling a steady growl. I did not head to the local hardware store. I merged onto the highway and drove straight toward the towering skyline of downtown Manhattan. The drive gave me ample time to solidify my strategy. For 5 years, I had embraced the quiet life of a retired widower. It was a conscious choice. After Kathy passed, the cutthroat world of corporate acquisitions lost its appeal. I wanted to focus entirely on Madeline and honor her mother's memory by staying out of the public eye. But Trent had mistaken my deliberate withdrawal for weakness. He had looked at my faded flannel and grease-stained hands and seen a victim. He was about to learn a painful lesson about assumptions. The heavy traffic swallowed my truck, but I navigated the congested avenues with the practiced ease of a man who used to own them. I pulled up to a massive glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of the financial district. I bypassed the main parking structure entirely and drove down a restricted, heavily guarded ramp leading to the subterranean executive garage. The armed security guard in the booth stepped out, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio as my rusted truck approached the barrier. Then he saw my face through the windshield. His posture stiffened instantly. He swallowed hard, quickly lowered his hand, and pressed the button to lift the heavy steel gate without uttering a single word. I parked my old Ford directly between a pristine silver Bentley and a sleek black Maybach. The contrast was almost comical, but I did not care. I walked past the row of luxury vehicles and approached a solid steel door secured by a biometric scanner. I placed my thumb on the glowing glass pad. The light flashed green, and the heavy door hissed open, revealing a private wood-paneled elevator. I stepped inside, pressed the single polished button, and felt the immense surge of gravity as the car shot silently upward toward the penthouse. The doors slid open to reveal the sprawling, ultra-luxurious executive suite of Pinnacle Holdings. The reception area was an expansive masterpiece of Italian marble, imported leather, and panoramic windows offering a commanding view of the entire city. The receptionist, a highly efficient young woman who usually guarded this floor with terrifying precision, looked up from her monitors. Her eyes widened slightly, but she knew exactly who I was. She stood up immediately, offering a respectful nod as I walked past her desk without breaking my stride. I am not a poor, struggling retiree trying to survive on a meager pension. I am the silent founder, the primary architect, and the majority shareholder of Pinnacle Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm that controls dozens of international corporations. I built this empire with the very hands Trent had openly mocked the night before. I bled for this company, outmaneuvering the most ruthless financial predators on Wall Street to secure my family's absolute security. When Kathy died, I stepped back from the daily operations, installing a board of trusted directors to manage the aggressive acquisitions while I maintained absolute controlling interest from the shadows. I wanted Madeline to build her own life free from the overwhelming pressure and toxic scrutiny of immense wealth. I wanted her to find a partner who loved her for who she was, not for the size of her trust fund. Trent thought he had found an easy target, a gullible nurse with a nice house and a pathetic father. He had absolutely no idea he was attempting to steal from the daughter of a man who could financially obliterate his entire lineage with a single phone call. I walked into my expansive private office, which had been perfectly maintained in my absence. The heavy mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, dominating the space. I did not sit down. I pressed a button on the secure intercom system and spoke clearly. "Send Jonathan in here immediately." Within 90 seconds, the thick double doors opened. Jonathan Pierce walked into the room. Jonathan was my lead fixer, my senior legal counsel, and the most efficient problem solver in the entire financial sector. Jonathan was impeccably dressed, in a sharp charcoal suit, carrying a secure tablet. He looked at my faded flannel shirt and work boots, then up at my face. He recognized the cold severity in my eyes immediately. He knew this was not a social visit. He knew the sleeping giant had just been violently awakened. "Welcome back, Harrison," he said quietly, closing the heavy doors behind him to ensure total privacy. "What is the situation?" I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the reconstructed default notice. I walked over to the mahogany desk and dropped the taped-together document directly in front of him. I stood tall, letting the full weight of my authority fill the silent room. "I want you to read," that I commanded. Jonathan picked up the brittle paper. His expert eyes scanned the legal jargon, the offshore lender crest, the extortionate interest rates, And finally, my daughter's forged signature. His jaw tightened visibly. His professional composure cracked for a fraction of a second as the reality of the document sank in. Someone has stolen Madeline's identity to secure a shadow loan from a high-risk offshore syndicate. He stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. Who did this? I leaned over the desk, planting my calloused hands firmly on the polished wood. The man she's supposed to marry this weekend, I said, my voice dripping with pure venom. Trent Lawson. He is using her property as collateral to pay off a massive debt, and he brought cartel enforcers to her front lawn yesterday afternoon to negotiate his terrifying extension. Jonathan placed the document back on the desk, his eyes locking onto mine. He did not ask for further explanations. He simply waited for his instructions. Rip Trent Lawson's life completely apart, I ordered, my words cutting through the quiet office like a scalpel. I want his bank records, his offshore accounts, his corporate emails, and his deep web footprints. I want to know every single person he owes money to, every lie he has told, and every secret he has ever buried. Spare no expense. Use every resource and every contact this firm has at its disposal. I want his entire existence brought to me on a silver platter by tomorrow morning. Jonathan nodded once. Consider him dismantled, Harrison. I will start the extraction protocol immediately. Jonathan slowly nodded, once his dark eyes gleaming with a cold, shared understanding. Consider him entirely and completely dismantled, Harrison. I will personally start the extraction protocol immediately. The next 48 hours were an exercise in absolute agonizing restraint. I returned to Madeline's house and resumed my role as the tired, broken-down handyman. I watched Trent parade around the kitchen, his arrogance seemingly inflated by his supposed business trip to Boston. He patted my shoulder, asked about the plumbing, and kissed my daughter with the practiced ease of a sociopath. I smiled. I nodded. I played the pathetic, grateful father flawlessly, all while the clock ticked down to his destruction. On the second evening, my encrypted phone vibrated once. It was a secure coordinate ping from Jonathan. I made an excuse about needing a specialized pipe wrench from the overnight supply store and drove my rusted truck out into the cold, rainy night. The location was an abandoned underground parking garage beneath a half-constructed commercial high-rise on the edge of the financial district. It was a perfectly isolated concrete cavern, completely devoid of security cameras and prying eyes. I parked the truck next to a massive concrete pillar and cut the engine. The only sound was the distant rhythmic dripping of rainwater leaking through the unfinished ceiling. A sleek black sedan emerged, its headlights cutting through the gloom. It pulled up slowly beside me, the engine purring quietly. Jonathan stepped out into the damp air, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. His face was a mask of cold, professional intensity. He did not offer a polite greeting. He placed the briefcase onto the hood and snapped the locks open. The dossier inside was easily 3 inches thick. It contained the complete, unfiltered anatomy of Trent Lawson. Harrison, Jonathan began, his voice echoing against the wet concrete. You were absolutely right to trust your instincts. The man your daughter is engaged to is nothing but a heavily leveraged illusion. I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket and illuminated the top page. It was a detailed employment profile. Trent was not a senior executive partner. He was a mid-level vice president at Apex Financial, a mid-tier investment firm that had been aggressively trying to punch above its weight class for the last decade. According to these intercepted internal communications, Trent is currently hanging by a thread, Jonathan explained. He has a severe gambling addiction that he hides behind offshore investment accounts. He completely wiped out his own savings, liquidated his meager assets, and then turned to shadow lenders to cover his catastrophic market losses. He owes the syndicate exactly $2.5 million. That is why he forged Madeline's signature. He needed a pristine asset to secure the cartel extension. I stared at the grim financial reports, feeling disgusted. He was a desperate fraud, wearing tailored suits bought on credit, driving a leased luxury car, and selling my daughter's future to buy himself a few more weeks of breathing room. But that is only the beginning. Jonathan continued, his tone shifting. I ran a deep diagnostic on Apex Financial itself. The entire firm is drowning in a sea of toxic debt. They over-leveraged themselves on a series of disastrous commercial real estate acquisitions last quarter. They are quietly hemorrhaging capital. If they do not secure a massive influx of cash within the next 10 days, they will be forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They are desperately seeking a total corporate buyout to save themselves from total ruin. I looked up from the papers. A failing firm, a desperate employee. It was a perfect storm of corporate vulnerability. And who are they begging for this miraculous buyout? I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the echoing dark. Jonathan smiled slightly. He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a separate, highly confidential acquisition proposal. He handed it to me. They are begging us, Harrison. Apex Financial has submitted a desperate 11th-hour plea to Pinnacle Holdings. They are practically on their knees begging our acquisitions department to swallow them whole before the market realizes they are insolvent. My eyes scanned the executive summary. There it was. The shining emblem of Pinnacle Holdings, the empire I had built with my bare hands, sitting at the top of the page. The sheer impossible irony of the situation hit me like a physical blow. But the supreme twist was yet to come. Jonathan tapped his finger firmly against the lead negotiator listed on the Apex proposal. Apex is sending their most aggressive negotiator to secure the deal, Jonathan said quietly. Trent Lawson. He has positioned himself as the savior of his firm. If he successfully closes the buyout with Pinnacle Holdings, his contracted closing bonus is exactly $2 million. He is banking his life on this single deal. He intends to use the commission to pay off the cartel, using Madeline's house as the temporary collateral just to keep them away until the ink dries on the Pinnacle contract. I stared at the name printed on the glossy paper. Trent Lawson. He was walking into the lion's den completely blind and hopelessly outmatched. He had spent the last 2 weeks talking down to me, mocking my faded jeans, laughing at my calloused hands, and calling me a clueless old man. He had casually dismissed me as a pathetic, unemployed loser who could not even afford a decent plumber. He had no idea that the phantom billionaire he was desperately trying to impress, the unseen corporate titan holding his literal life in the palm of his hand, was the very man he was actively trying to destroy. The universe had a wicked, beautiful sense of humor. I closed the leather briefcase with a sharp, decisive snap. The sound echoed loudly. The cold fury that had been burning inside my chest for days suddenly crystallized into absolute, terrifying clarity. I did not just want to stop him from stealing my daughter's house. I wanted to obliterate his reality. I wanted to stand in that boardroom and watch the color drain from his arrogant face when he realized his fatal mistake. Jonathan, I said, my voice steady, cold, and resonating with absolute, unquestionable authority in the darkness. Schedule the final acquisition meeting with Apex Financial for tomorrow afternoon. Bring them into the main executive boardroom at Pinnacle Holdings. Tell them the silent founder has personally decided to oversee the final terms of the buyout. Jonathan's smile widened slightly. He recognized the tone. It was the voice of the man who had mercilessly conquered the financial world. Consider it done, Harrison. Will you be wearing a suit? I looked down at my worn, grease-stained boots and the frayed cuffs of my flannel shirt. I thought about the patronizing smirk Trent wore every single time he looked at me. I thought about the forged default notice sitting heavily in my pocket. No, I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper. I think I will go exactly as I am. Let him see the clueless old man just one last time before I burn his entire world to the ground. Jonathan did not blink, nor did he question my sudden shift in demeanor. He had been by my side during the most aggressive corporate takeovers of the last 2 decades, and he knew that when I adopted this particular tone, someone was about to lose everything they held dear. He simply nodded his fingers, dancing rapidly across the glowing screen of his secure tablet to initiate the process. I walked slowly over to the panoramic window of my penthouse office, looking down at the sprawling metropolis below. Millions of people were rushing through their daily lives, completely oblivious to the massive shifts of power and wealth happening in the glass towers above them. Trent Lawson thought he was one of the untouchable elite manipulating that power. He was about to find out exactly where he stood in the actual food chain. I turned back to Jonathan, my hands clasped firmly behind my back. "The Apex financial buyout is approved," I stated, my voice echoing off the polished mahogany walls. Jonathan stopped typing and looked up, a rare expression of genuine surprise crossing his normally stoic features. "You want to save the company that employs the man threatening your daughter?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral, but carrying a hint of confusion. "I do not want to save them, Jonathan," I replied, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. "I want to buy them. I want to own them completely. But we are not going to hand Trent Lawson a $2 million closing commission so he can pay off a cartel and secure his freedom. We are going to lock him in a cage of his own desperate making." I stepped back to this massive desk and leaned forward. "Contact Bradley Carmichael, the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Financial. Tell him that Pinnacle Holdings is officially accepting their desperate plea for a total corporate acquisition. Tell him we are willing to absorb their toxic debt and save them from a highly public, humiliating bankruptcy. But there is one lethal, absolutely non-negotiable condition attached to our capital injection." Jonathan leaned in, his dark eyes fixed entirely on me, waiting for the killing blow. "Inform Carmichael that Pinnacle Holdings will only proceed with the acquisition if every single executive at Apex undergoes a brutal zero-notice forensic audit conducted personally by our internal security and compliance team," I instructed. "Tell him that absolutely no bonuses, no severance packages, and no closing commissions will be paid out until our auditors have completely scrubbed their personal and professional accounts. We demand unfettered access to their banking records, their offshore holding companies, their digital footprints, and their entire financial history. If Carmichael balks at the invasion of privacy, you tell him the deal is dead, and he can explain his failure to his starving shareholders on Monday morning." Jonathan let out a low, deeply appreciative chuckle. It was the sound of a master strategist recognizing a flawless trap. "It is a brilliant play, Harrison," he said, his fingers flying across the keyboard to draft the binding terms. "Apex is currently bleeding capital from a dozen self-inflicted wounds. Carmichael is far too desperate to refuse our terms. He will throw his entire executive board under the bus to save his own position. And Trent Lawson is currently banking his actual life on securing that specific $2 million commission. By freezing the payout, pending an invasive forensic audit, you are cutting his oxygen line. The moment our auditors begin their deep dive, they will inevitably uncover his offshore shadow loans, his severe gambling debts, and the forged default notice bearing your daughter's name." "Exactly," I confirmed, my voice hardening into steel. "Trent is expecting a quiet, celebratory boardroom meeting tomorrow afternoon, where he walks away a wealthy man. He believes he has completely outsmarted the system. Instead, he will be walking directly into a financial firing squad. I want our best forensic accountants waiting in that room. I want every single illicit transaction he has made over the past 5 years printed, bound, and placed on the table before he even sits down." Jonathan did not waste another second. He picked up his encrypted office phone, dialed the direct emergency line for the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Financial, and placed the call on speaker. The phone rang only twice before Bradley Carmichael answered. His voice was breathless, tight, with the kind of crushing anxiety that only comes from staring into the abyss of total corporate ruin. "Jonathan Pierce from Pinnacle Holdings." Jonathan announced smoothly, his tone devoid of any empathy. "I have my founder and majority shareholder listening in on this call. We have reviewed your emergency acquisition proposal." "Oh, thank God!" Carmichael gasped, the sheer relief in his voice palpable even through the digital connection. "Jonathan, please tell your founder that Apex is ready to fully cooperate. We are prepared to sign the initial letters of intent tonight. We need this capital injection to stabilize our commercial real estate portfolio before the market opens tomorrow. Our lead negotiator, Trent Lawson, has assured me that the terms are incredibly favorable for Pinnacle. Jonathan cut him off with the precision of a surgeon. Do not speak to me about favorable terms, Bradley. My founder has authorized the buyout, but he has attached a strict compliance contingency. Pinnacle Holdings will assume your debt, but only if your entire executive leadership team submits to a complete zero-notice forensic audit conducted by our internal specialists. We require immediate, unrestricted access to all personal and corporate financial records for every vice president and above. Furthermore, absolutely no closing commissions will be released until the audit is completely finalized. There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear Carmichael sweating, weighing the massive invasion of his executive's privacy against the total annihilation of his company. Jonathan Carmichael finally stammered, his voice trembling slightly. That is an incredibly unorthodox and highly invasive condition. Our executives have strict privacy clauses in their contracts. Withholding their commissions could cause a severe internal revolt, especially Trent Lawson. He has worked tirelessly to broker this specific deal. Jonathan did not yield a single inch. That is our final non-negotiable offer, Bradley, he replied, his voice dropping to a terrifying chill. You have exactly 30 seconds to decide if you want to protect the privacy of your executives or if you want to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on Monday. The choice is yours, but we will not negotiate this point. The line was silent for 10 agonizing seconds. Then Carmichael exhaled a heavy, defeated breath. I accept the condition, he whispered. Send your auditors. Just please save my company. Jonathan ended the call with a sharp click. He looked up at me, a wolfish grin spreading across his face. The trap is officially set, Harrison. The noose is tied and the drop is prepared. Trent Lawson has absolutely no idea that he is walking into his own execution tomorrow. I nodded slowly, feeling a cold, dark satisfaction settling deep into my bones. The trap was indeed set. Trent was currently out there somewhere, likely celebrating his impending victory, entirely oblivious to the fact that I had just quietly and methodically severed his only lifeline. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game with an old fool who did not understand the modern world. He thought he could threaten my daughter, steal her secure future, and simply walk away untouched. I turned away from the panoramic window and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors of my office. Have the audit dossier completely finalized and waiting on the main boardroom table by 2:00 tomorrow afternoon, I instructed Jonathan as I reached for the handle. I will be returning to Madeline's house now to play the part of the ignorant, exhausted handyman. Let him enjoy his final night of false security. Tomorrow I will personally pull the lever. I walked out of the luxurious penthouse suite, leaving the quiet hum of immense corporate power behind me. The private elevator descended rapidly, the physical pressure mirroring the heavy burden I was carrying. I stepped back out into the dimly lit subterranean executive garage. The damp, cold air was a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of my office. I climbed back into the driver's seat of my battered 1998 Ford, the worn fabric of the seat familiar and grounding. I turned the key, and the old engine roared to life, a rough, unrefined sound that echoed loudly against the concrete walls. As I drove out of the city and merged back onto the crowded highway, heading toward the quiet suburbs, I let my posture slump just slightly. I practiced the tired, vacant expression I would need to wear when I walked back through Madeline's front door. I had to bury the billionaire founder deep inside and resurrect the clueless working-class father. The transition was always jarring, but tonight it felt like putting on a suit of armor. Trent had chosen to awaken a monster, but he would not see its face until the very last possible second. The drive home was a slow, deliberate march toward the inevitable. The stage was set, the actors were moving into their final positions, and the final act was about to begin. The tires of my beat-up Ford hummed a steady rhythm against the damp asphalt as I navigated the winding suburban streets back to Madeline's neighborhood. I parked in the driveway, intentionally letting the engine sputter and cough before cutting the ignition. I walked through the front door, rolling my shoulders and adopting the sluggish gait of an old man whose body was breaking down from a lifetime of manual labor. Madeline was in the kitchen, humming softly as she chopped vegetables for a late lunch. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes full of warmth and completely devoid of suspicion. I offered her a tired smile, complaining mildly about the long lines at the hardware store and the rising cost of copper fittings. She poured me a fresh cup of coffee, kissed my cheek, and announced she was heading upstairs to take a quick shower before her evening shift at the hospital. The moment I heard the bathroom door click shut and the water start running, my posture straightened. The weariness vanished from my bones, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of a hunter closing in on his prey. I had set the trap at the corporate level, but I needed to know exactly how Trent planned to react when the jaws snapped shut. I needed to know what his desperate mind would scheme regarding my daughter. I walked silently down the hallway and slipped into his pristine home office. The room smelled of expensive leather and arrogant ambition. I moved directly to his massive mahogany desk. From the false bottom of my heavy toolbox, I retrieved a tiny matte black disc. It was a military-grade audio transmitter, a highly sophisticated piece of surveillance equipment, utilizing encrypted frequencies that Jonathan had provided during our meeting. I crawled under the desk, bypassed the standard wooden joints, and pressed the magnetic base of the bug deep into a recessed metal cavity where it would be impossible to detect without professional sweeping equipment. With the device securely planted, I quietly exited the office, leaving the door exactly as I had found it. Madeline came downstairs a few minutes later, fresh and energetic. I hugged her goodbye, told her I was going to grab a bite to eat at a local diner, and walked out to my truck. I did not drive to a diner. I drove exactly 1 block away, parking my rusted Ford under the thick canopy of an old sprawling oak tree. The dense foliage completely obscured my vehicle from the street. I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out the paired receiver. I placed the small encrypted earpiece into my right ear and turned the dial. A soft hum of static filled my ear, followed instantly by the crystal-clear sound of the ticking grandfather clock in Madeline's hallway. The audio feed was perfect. Now all I had to do was wait. The wait was not long. Less than an hour later, a sleek silver Audi sped down the street and screeched into the driveway. Through my rearview mirror, I watched Trent Lawson storm out of his car. He did not look like the polished, confident executive who had left the house that morning. His tie was loosened, his suit jacket was unbuttoned, and his movements were jerky and frantic. I heard the heavy thud of the front door slamming shut through my earpiece. A few seconds later, the distinct sound of the office door opening and closing confirmed he had entered his sanctuary. I settled back into the worn fabric of my truck seat and closed my eyes, focusing entirely on the audio feed. Inside the office, Trent was pacing violently. I could hear his expensive leather shoes stomping heavily against the hardwood floor. He was breathing in sharp, ragged gasps. Suddenly, the sharp ringing of his cell phone pierced the room. He snatched it up on the first ring. Bradley Trent practically shouted, his voice vibrating with a mixture of anger and raw panic. "Tell me you did not agree to those insane terms. Tell me you told Pinnacle Holdings to take their audit and shove it." The voice of Bradley Carmichael, the chief executive officer of Apex Financial, bled through the phone speaker loud enough for the bug to capture every word. "We had no choice," Trent Bradley replied, his tone heavy with exhaustion and defeat. The board convened an emergency session. "We are bleeding cash. If we do not accept the Pinnacle acquisition, we have to file for bankruptcy on Monday. We signed the preliminary agreement 20 minutes ago. The zero-notice forensic audit is officially mandated for every single executive." "You cannot let them do this to me," Trent screamed, his voice cracking into a high pitch. "You promised me that $2 million closing commission by Friday. I brought Pinnacle to the table. I secured the lifeline for this entire firm. You owe me that money, Bradley. You cannot let them freeze my accounts. I do not owe you anything but a pink slip if you continue screaming at me." Bradley fired back, his patience entirely gone. Pinnacle holds all the cards. They demanded unrestricted access to our personal banking records, our offshore accounts, and our deep web footprints. If you have nothing to hide, Trent, then you have nothing to worry about. The auditors will be here tomorrow morning. Have your files ready." The line went dead with a sharp click. For 5 agonizing seconds, there was absolute silence in the office. Then the eruption began. Trent let out a guttural, animalistic roar of pure rage. I heard the violent crash of heavy objects sweeping off the mahogany desk and slamming into the wall. Glass shattered into 1,000 pieces as he likely threw a framed photograph or a liquor decanter. He was kicking the furniture, screaming obscenities, completely destroying the perfectly curated illusion of his sophisticated life. The forensic audit was a death sentence, and he knew it. It would expose his catastrophic gambling debts, his shadow loans, and his fraudulent use of my daughter's pristine identity. The walls were closing in, and the polished executive was reverting to a cornered beast. The violent destruction suddenly stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy, panicked breathing. I heard the unmistakable click of a floor safe opening. Then the rapid, frantic beeping of numbers being dialed on a cheap plastic keypad. He had a burner phone, a secure, untraceable line he kept hidden for his darkest transactions. The line rang 3 times before a cold, gravelly voice answered. "I need more time." Trent begged, his voice dropping to a pathetic, trembling whisper. "The Pinnacle deal just got complicated. They are demanding a full forensic audit before they release my commission. It might take another month to get the cash. I just need a 30-day extension." There was a dry, humorless chuckle on the other end of the line. "We do not do 30-day extensions, Trent," the gravelly voice replied, each word dripping with casual menace. "We do not care about your corporate audits or your billionaire buyouts. You owe us $2.5 million. The deadline was the 14th. You brought us a prenuptial agreement and a property deed as collateral. You promised that once the marriage certificate was signed, the house would be transferred into a trust under your control, and you would liquidate it to pay us back." "I will," Trent pleaded, desperation choking his words. "The wedding is in 4 days. Once we are married, I have the legal right to leverage the property. Just give me until then. I will sign the entire house over to the syndicate. You can take it all. Just do not touch me." "We are not going to touch you, Trent," the man said, his voice dropping to a terrifying deadpan. "We are going to take the house. And if that nurse you are marrying causes any problems or refuses to sign the final trust documents, we will handle her too. We know where she works. We know her schedule. You ensure that property is ours by next week, or we will carve our $2.5 million out of both of your hides." The call disconnected. I sat in my truck, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned pure white, the audio feeding a dark, murderous resolve directly into my veins. The dead tone of the disconnected call hung in the air, buzzing through my earpiece with a sickening finality. Inside the office, Trent did not move. I could hear his shallow, rapid breaths scraping against the silence of the room. He was backed into a corner, but animals like Trent Lawson never simply surrender. They dig deeper into the mud. I heard the sharp intake of a long breath followed by the rapid tapping of the burner phone keypad again. He was making a second call. This time the ringing lasted longer before someone finally answered. The voice on the other end was not the gravelly baritone of a cartel enforcer. It was a slick, familiar, almost bored voice. It was a man I recognized from the peripheral files Jonathan had compiled. It was Marcus Vance, a disgraced former corporate lawyer who operated strictly in the shadows, helping desperate executives hide their illicit assets. Trent launched into the frantic tirade the second the line connected. "Marcus, you must expedite the secondary policy," Trent hissed, his voice vibrating with dread and manic energy. "The syndicate just threatened to take the house and go after Madeline if the deed is not transferred next week. The Pinnacle audit will freeze my $2 million commission. I am out of options." Marcus sighed loudly. "You brought this on yourself, Trent. I warned you about leveraging those volatile cryptocurrency portfolios. You chased massive margins, lost everything, and tried to win it back at an underground high-stakes table. You do not just owe the cartel the $2.5 million principal for the property collateral. With compound penalties, your total unrecorded debt is exactly $4 million. They will skin you alive if you do not deliver the entire sum. I sat in the dark cabin of my rusted truck, my blood turning to ice. The financial hole was unimaginably deep. But Trent's response chilled me to the bone. I know exactly how much I owe Marcus. Trent snapped back, his voice dropping into a dead register. That is why the house was only ever meant to be a temporary pacifier. It keeps the enforcers off my back, just long enough to activate the primary payload. I need confirmation that the $5 million comprehensive life insurance policy on Madeline is fully underwritten and binding the moment the marriage certificate is legally registered. The silence stretched for an agonizing second before Marcus replied. The policy is ironclad. Because you established the irrevocable property trust as the primary beneficiary, the payout will bypass standard probate completely. As the sole managing trustee, you will have immediate access to the $5 million in liquid cash. But the insurance firm will investigate any sudden tragedy, Trent. They do not hand over $5 million without asking questions. Trent let out a soft laugh completely devoid of human empathy. There will be no questions to ask, he said smoothly. Madeline has a highly documented history of severe life-threatening allergies. She takes a daily medication to manage her respiratory reactions. It is a strict routine she follows every single morning before her shifts. I have acquired a synthetic, completely untraceable narcotic compound from an offshore contact. It perfectly mimics the physiological symptoms of acute anaphylactic shock. 6 months after the wedding, once the dust has settled and the policy is fully matured, I will simply swap her morning capsules. She will drive to work, experience a sudden respiratory collapse, and the medical examiner will rule it a tragic allergic reaction. There will be no toxicological red flags. It will be the perfect invisible accident. I will play the devastated widower, collect the $5 million, pay off the cartel, and walk away clean. The words echoed through my earpiece, slicing into my mind like jagged shards of glass. He was not just a greedy corporate climber looking to steal a house. He was not just a desperate, degenerate gambler trying to cover his massive offshore losses. Trent Lawson was a calculating sociopath, actively planning the methodical, premeditated murder of my only daughter. He was going to stand at an altar, look into her trusting eyes, vow to cherish her for the rest of his life, and then slowly count down the days until he poisoned her for a life insurance payout. He viewed her existence as nothing more than a convenient financial stepping stone, a disposable asset to be liquidated the moment she was no longer useful. My hands trembled violently, not from fear, but from a profound, terrifying rage that I had never experienced in my entire 70 years of life. The anger I had felt when I discovered the forged prenuptial agreement was absolutely nothing compared to the dark, bottomless abyss of wrath currently consuming my soul. Inside the office, Marcus gave a low whistle. You are playing a very dangerous game, Trent. If you slip up, you will spend the rest of your life in federal prison. Trent scoffed arrogantly. I do not slip up, Marcus. I am the smartest man in any room I walk into. I have completely fooled her, and I have completely fooled her pathetic working-class loser of a father. They are simple, remarkably naive people. They trust me implicitly. Just ensure the policy documents are finalized and ready for my signature on Monday morning. I will handle everything else on this end. The burner phone disconnected with a sharp beep. I heard Trent let out a long, satisfied sigh, his immediate panic soothed by the comfort of his murderous contingency plan. The heavy oak door of his office clicked open, and his footsteps padded softly down the hallway, heading back upstairs toward the master bedroom, where my daughter was sleeping. I slowly removed the encrypted earpiece from my ear. The silence of the dark suburban street felt suffocating. I stared through the windshield of my old Ford at the pristine 2-story house standing peacefully in the night. Inside those walls, a monster was resting comfortably next to the woman who was my entire world. The urge to kick down the front door, march up the stairs, and end his miserable existence right then and there was almost impossible to resist. My muscles coiled with violent tension. But I am a man who built a global empire through flawless, systematic destruction, not reckless emotion. Killing him would put me behind bars and leave Madeline entirely devastated and confused, mourning a man she thought was her perfect soulmate. I could not simply eliminate him physically. I had to completely dismantle his entire reality. I had to expose his absolute depravity to the world, trap him in his own and let the very monsters he owed money to handle his ultimate punishment. I started the engine of my truck. The deep guttural growl perfectly matched the dark, relentless promise echoing inside my own heart. Trent Lawson thought he was the smartest predator in the jungle. He had absolutely no idea that he had just forced a protective father to become the most dangerous apex predator on Earth. Tomorrow, the wedding rehearsal would begin, and tomorrow I would execute his total annihilation. The burner phone vibrated violently against the mahogany desk, a harsh buzzing sound that shattered the brief silence in the office. Trent snatched it up immediately, his breathing shallow and frantic. The call had not entirely disconnected, or perhaps the enforcer had simply placed him on a brief, agonizing hold to let the terror fully marinate. When the gravelly voice returned, it carried a new, highly specific tone of dangerous curiosity. "We noticed something else when my men visited your little suburban paradise today," the enforcer said slowly. "Who is the old man poking around the front porch with a wrench?" He did not look like a standard neighborhood landscaper. He looked entirely too observant. He looked like a potential problem, Trent. And we absolutely loathe potential problems. I sat rigidly in the dark cabin of my Ford, my pulse hammering a steady, deafening rhythm against my eardrums. I waited for Trent to panic, to stumble over his words, to perhaps finally realize the catastrophic danger he had brought down upon himself. Instead, a harsh, remarkably cruel laugh erupted from his throat. The sound was completely devoid of anxiety. It was dripping with pure, unadulterated arrogance. He actually sounded amused by the inquiry. "You mean Bill?" Trent asked, his voice dripping with profound disgust. "Madeline's father. You do not need to worry about him for a single second. He is an absolute nobody, a senile, broke loser who spent his entire pathetic life swinging a hammer and fixing toilets. He can barely afford to buy his own groceries, let alone pose a threat to anyone. He is just a clinging, pathetic old man trying to play the protective patriarch because he has absolutely nothing else to live for." The enforcer grunted, clearly unconvinced. "Naive old men can still dial a police telephone number, Trent. If he is staying in that house, he is a massive liability to the collateral. If he gets in the way of our collection, my guys will not hesitate to handle him permanently. I will not tolerate a messy transition when we come to claim that property." Trent laughed again, a dark, sinister sound that made my skin crawl. "There will be no messy transition, and you will not need to waste your time handling him," Trent assured the cartel thug smoothly. "I have already anticipated the Bill problem, and I have a foolproof contingency plan locked and loaded. As soon as Madeline and I sign the marriage certificate this weekend, my legal authority over her and her immediate family expands significantly. The moment the house is legally transferred into my irrevocable property trust, I am tying up the final loose end." The enforcer remained silent, listening intently, as Trent proudly unveiled the absolute depth of his depravity. "I have a private medical associate." Trent continued, his voice brimming with wicked pride. "A highly credentialed, remarkably unethical psychiatrist who owes me a very large, very expensive favor for hiding his own financial indiscretions last year. The morning after the wedding, this doctor is going to conduct a sudden emergency house call. He is going to officially evaluate Bill and sign a binding medical affidavit declaring the old man entirely mentally unfit, suffering from rapid onset aggressive dementia, and posing a severe immediate physical danger to himself and his daughter. I closed my eyes, the cold air of the truck cabin washing over my rigid face. He was not just planning to steal my daughter's home and orchestrate her murder for a life insurance payout. He had actively engineered a parallel nightmare exclusively for me. With that medical affidavit in hand, Trent explained cheerfully, "I will easily assume full legal emergency guardianship over him. I will freeze whatever miserable empty checking accounts he has left, take control of his meager pension, and permanently remove him from the premises. But I am not putting him in a nice, comfortable retirement community. I am dumping him in the absolute cheapest, most decrepit state-run psychiatric ward in the entire county. The kind of underfunded, forgotten hellhole where the staff does not ask any questions and the patients simply disappear into the system." He paused, taking a long sip of whatever expensive liquor he had just poured himself. Within a week, Trent boasted, his voice chillingly calm. "They will have him so heavily medicated with chemical restraints that he will be nothing more than a drooling, unresponsive vegetable staring blankly at a padded wall. He will not be able to form a coherent sentence, let alone make a phone call to the authorities or warn Madeline about anything. He will simply vanish into the shadows, a tragic victim of natural mental decline. Madeline will be devastated, of course, but I will be right there to comfort her, playing the strong, supportive husband, managing her father's tragic illness right up until her own unfortunate, fatal allergic reaction. It is a perfectly clean, perfectly invisible sweep." The cartel enforcer let out a low, dark chuckle. "You are a remarkably cold piece of work, Lawson. I will give you that. You ensure the property deed is securely in your name by the 14th, and we will let you play your little domestic games. But if you miss that deadline by a single hour, we will bypass the old man and the nurse and come directly for your throat." The burner phone disconnected with a sharp final click. I heard Trent toss the device onto the desk, his heavy footsteps retreating from the office and heading toward the staircase. The house plunged back into total heavy silence save for the rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock transmitting through my earpiece. I sat in the rusted driver's seat for a very long time. The street lamps outside cast long, distorted shadows across the hood of my truck. The rain had stopped, leaving the night air thick, heavy, and absolutely freezing. The anger that had been simmering inside me for the past 72 hours underwent a fundamental, terrifying transformation. It burned away the initial shock. It burned away the paternal heartbreak. It burned away every single ounce of human mercy I possessed. What was left was absolute, crystalline, and perfectly calculated wrath. Trent Lawson had meticulously designed a masterpiece of pure evil. He had looked at a family that had shown him nothing but kindness and envisioned a slaughterhouse. He planned to rip my daughter's life away for a payout, and he planned to erase my mind and lock my body in a chemical prison just to ensure his theft went smoothly. He thought his plan was flawless. He thought he held every single card. He had no idea that the senile, broke loser he intended to institutionalize was the apex predator of the global financial market. He had no idea that the hands he mocked as pathetic and weak had crushed international corporations and dismantled billionaires who were infinitely smarter and infinitely more dangerous than a desperate mid-level vice president with a gambling addiction. I pulled the earpiece from my ear and placed it carefully into the glove compartment. Tomorrow, the final war would officially begin. Trent Lawson was already a dead man walking. The morning sun broke through the heavy cloud cover, casting a pale light across Madeline's meticulously manicured lawn. Inside the house, the atmosphere was a whirlwind of frantic, joyous energy. It was exactly 2 days for the wedding, and the entire residence had been transformed into a staging ground for floral arrangements, caterer consultations, and last-minute dress fittings. Madeline was glowing, completely consumed by the illusion of her impending happily ever after. Trent drifted through the chaos with the practiced grace of a seasoned actor. He poured coffee for the bridesmaids, offered charming, self-deprecating jokes to the wedding planner, and wrapped his arms around my daughter from behind, kissing her neck while she reviewed seating charts. He looked absolutely picture-perfect. To anyone else, he was the ideal devoted fiancé. But I could see the rigid tension in his jaw. I could see the way his eyes darted toward his cell phone every time it chimed. He was waiting for confirmation that his life insurance policy was fully bound. He was waiting for the financial noose to loosen. He had no idea it was already pulled tight. I excused myself from the kitchen, claiming I needed to inspect the outdoor sprinkler system before the caterers set up their tents. Once outside, I walked past the hedges and stepped into the insulated privacy of my rusted Ford. I locked the heavy doors, rolled up the manual windows, and pulled Jonathan's encrypted tablet from beneath the passenger seat. The screen flared to life, displaying a highly secure data package transmitted from our internal audit team at Pinnacle Holdings. The zero-notice forensic audit on Apex Financial had been executing quietly and ruthlessly throughout the night. The preliminary findings were precisely what I had anticipated, but the staggering scale of the theft was breathtaking. Trent Lawson had not merely borrowed money from the shadows to cover his catastrophic cryptocurrency losses. According to the meticulously sourced ledgers glowing on the tablet screen, Trent had actively embezzled exactly $1.5 million directly from Apex Financial over the past 24 months. He had created a complex web of dummy vendor accounts, siphoning corporate funds through phantom consulting fees, just to cover the exorbitant compounding interest rates demanded by the cartel. He had bled his own company dry while simultaneously positioning himself as their financial savior through the Pinnacle buyout. Beside the financial audit file sat a separate encrypted audio folder. It contained the crystal-clear, irrefutable recordings from the military-grade bug I had planted under his desk. I had his full confession. I had his explicit, calculated plan to institutionalize me in a psychiatric ward. And I had his cold, methodical timeline for the premeditated murder of my only daughter. I possessed enough ammunition to put him in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. But a quiet arrest was far too merciful for a monster who intended to poison my child. I needed a public, devastating execution. I opened the secure communication application on the tablet and initiated a direct, untraceable call to the private executive line of Bradley Carmichael, the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Financial. The line rang twice before Carmichael answered. His voice was incredibly tense, stretched thin by the terror of the impending Pinnacle audit and the looming threat of corporate bankruptcy. Carmichael speaking. He answered abruptly, clearly expecting another demanding update from my acquisition team. Bradley. My voice resonated through the secure connection, dropping the gentle cadence of the tired handyman and adopting the absolute authority of a corporate titan. This is Harrison, the founder and majority shareholder of Pinnacle Holdings. We have urgent business regarding your lead negotiator, Trent Lawson. I have just authorized my security team to transmit a classified file to your private email. I suggest you open it immediately. There was a sharp intake of breath. I heard the frantic, desperate clicking of a keyboard as Bradley rushed to access his secure terminal. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched across the line as he opened the document. It was a perfectly organized, indisputable summary of Trent's massive embezzlement operation. I listened closely as Bradley's breathing turned ragged. He let out a low, horrified gasp as the reality of the numbers sank in. Trent had systematically stolen $1.5 million from the very firm he claimed to be saving. My God. Bradley whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound shock and absolute rage. This is impossible. Trent is the one who brokered the Pinnacle deal. He is our senior vice president. He has been siphoning our operating capital into phantom accounts for 2 years. He is the primary reason we are facing insolvency in the first place. He has completely destroyed us from the inside. He is a parasite, Bradley. I stated coldly, cutting through his panic. He created the financial disease that is killing your company, and he is currently attempting to sell you the cure. He intends to use the $2 million closing commission from our acquisition to pay off a violently aggressive criminal cartel. If Pinnacle Holdings had not mandated this forensic audit, you would have handed a massive fortune to the man who actively engineered your corporate ruin. I am terminating him immediately, Bradley declared, his voice rising in pitch. I am calling the federal authorities. I am having him arrested before he can step foot inside this building again. I will not let this criminal tear down my entire life's work. You will do absolutely no such thing, I commanded, my voice striking like a physical blow, demanding absolute, unquestioning obedience. You will not call the authorities. You will not alert your board of directors. And you will certainly not confront Trent Lawson. You will keep your mouth shut, Bradley, because Trent Lawson is currently engaged to marry my daughter. The dead silence that followed was absolute. Bradley Carmichael was not a stupid man. He instantly recognized the terrifying magnitude of the situation. He realized that his rogue employee had not just stolen corporate funds. He had unknowingly targeted the family of the most powerful financial predator in the country. Mr. Harrison Bradley finally whispered, his voice barely audible. I had absolutely no idea. I swear to you, the firm knew nothing about his personal affairs. I know you did not, Bradley, I replied evenly. If I believed you were complicit, Apex Financial would already be reduced to ashes. But you are going to help me execute a final, very specific measure of justice. Trent expects to marry my daughter this Saturday. He expects you to be sitting in the front row of the church representing his glorious corporate success. And that is exactly what you are going to do. I want you to attend the wedding ceremony tomorrow. You will shake his hand and smile. You will act as if he is the brilliant savior of your company. Give him no indication that his world has been compromised. Let him stand at that altar feeling completely invincible. And when the exact moment is right, I will personally pull the lever, and we will finally watch him hang together. The sun rose on the morning of the wedding, casting a brilliant, mocking golden light across the city. I stood in the small guest bedroom of Madeline's house, adjusting the collar of my rented suit. It was deliberately ill-fitting, slightly frayed at the cuffs, the perfect costume for the pathetic working-class father Trent believed me to be. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, burying the ruthless corporate titan deep beneath a mask of frail, exhausted humility. Today was the day the illusion would shatter, but until that precise second, I had to play my part flawlessly. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I turned as the door swung open, and the breath caught instantly in my throat. Madeline stood in the hallway, absolutely breathtaking, in a flowing white gown. But it was not the dress that made my heart ache. It was the delicate lace cascading over her shoulders. She was wearing Kathy's vintage veil. The delicate floral patterns framed her face exactly as they had framed her mother's 30 years ago. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated love, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "How do I look?" "You look exactly like your mother," I replied, my voice cracking with a genuine, overwhelming sorrow. Every single instinct I possessed as a father, every primal urge to protect my child, screamed at me to grab her hand, pull her down the stairs, push her into the passenger seat of my rusted truck, and drive as far away from Trent Lawson as the highway would take us. I wanted to tear the veil from her head and scream the horrifying truth about the monster waiting for her at the altar. I wanted to tell her about the forged signatures, the cartel enforcers, and the lethal narcotic he planned to slip into her allergy medication. But I brutally forced the words back down my throat. Snatching her away now would only confuse and devastate her. Trent was a master manipulator. He would twist my actions, paint me as a jealous, unstable old man having a mental breakdown, and she might actually believe him. To truly save her, to completely excise this parasite from her life forever, she had to see his destruction with her own eyes. She had to witness the absolute dismantling of his entire reality. I forced a warm, gentle smile, offering her my arm. We walked down the stairs together, stepping out into the crisp morning air where a waiting limousine idled by the curb. The drive to the venue was a quiet torture. Madeline chattered excitedly about the floral arrangements and the catering menu, completely oblivious to the dark storm gathering just beyond the horizon. We arrived at a sprawling, ultra-luxurious botanical garden estate on the edge of the city. Trent had spared absolutely no expense utilizing the stolen capital he believed was safely hidden to construct a monument to his own arrogance. The manicured lawns were dotted with pristine white tents, towering ice sculptures, and a string quartet playing soft classical music. It was a beautiful, sickening lie. I stepped out of the limousine leaning heavily on a wooden cane I did not actually need, playing the part of the fragile old man to absolute perfection. As we made our way toward the staging area behind the main seating arrangement, I scanned the perimeter with the practiced eyes of a predator. To the casual observer, the street outside the estate was merely lined with catering trucks and delivery vehicles, but I knew exactly what was hiding in plain sight. Jonathan had worked tirelessly through the night, utilizing our deepest federal contacts to meticulously coordinate the final strike. Inside 3 unremarkable matte black utility vans parked strategically near the main exit, a heavily armed tactical team from the Federal Bureau of Investigation was waiting in complete silence. They had reviewed the audio recordings, the forensic financial audit, and the undeniable proof of Trent's massive embezzlement operation. The invisible net had already been cast. The authorities were simply waiting for my definitive signal to pull it tight. I walked into the grand foyer of the estate and immediately spotted Trent holding court near the open bar. He looked devastatingly handsome in a custom-tailored tuxedo, laughing loudly and accepting congratulations from his sycophantic friends. He was completely in his element, radiating the toxic, smug confidence of a man who firmly believed he had conquered the world. He caught my eye across the room and offered a condescending, patronizing nod, his gaze briefly lingering on my cheap, ill-fitting suit, with a flash of unmistakable disgust. I lowered my head submissively, playing the weak, defeated man, letting him enjoy the intoxicating rush of his perceived supremacy. Then my eyes drifted slightly to the left, locating the front row of the guest seating. Bradley Carmichael, the chief executive officer of Apex Financial, was sitting exactly where I had commanded him to be. He wore a sharp gray suit, but his posture was rigid, his face pale and glistening with a thin layer of cold sweat. He looked like a man sitting on a live grenade. Trent walked over to him, clapping Bradley on the shoulder and smiling broadly, clearly interpreting his boss's nervous demeanor as anxiety over the impending Pinnacle buyout. Bradley forced a stiff, unnatural smile, gripping Trent's hand, while shooting a terrified, fleeting glance in my direction. I offered Bradley a microscopic, chilling nod of acknowledgement. The music suddenly shifted the string quartet, transitioning into the traditional bridal chorus. The guests rose to their feet in a synchronized wave of rustling silk and quiet murmurs. Madeline slipped her hand through the crook of my arm, her fingers trembling slightly with nervous anticipation. I patted her hand gently, anchoring myself. We stepped out of the shadows and began the slow, agonizing walk down the long, white-carpeted aisle. Hundreds of eyes turned toward us, but my vision was locked entirely on the man waiting at the end of the path. Trent stood at the altar looking like a victorious king, waiting to claim his ultimate prize. His chest was puffed out, his smile wide and triumphant, as he watched his beautiful, wealthy Mark walking directly into his trap. He was savoring the absolute high of his impending victory. He thought he was minutes away from securing his cartel payoff, his corporate promotion, and his murderous life insurance scheme. He had absolutely no idea that every single step I took toward him was another nail being hammered into his coffin. I was going to let him reach the absolute blinding peak of his miserable delusion. I was going to let him feel the warmth of the sun before I dragged him permanently into the dark abyss. I would watch the smug arrogance completely melt from his face. The federal authorities were ready. Jonathan was completely ready. And I was ready to finally deliver absolute justice for my family. This beautiful day would not end with a tragic wedding, but with the brutal, extremely public destruction of a dangerous monster. The agony of the ceremony was finally over. I had stood silently in the front row of the sprawling, sunlit botanical garden, watching the man who planned to murder my daughter slip a platinum band onto her finger. I had listened to him recite vows of eternal devotion, his voice smooth and utterly devoid of genuine emotion. It had taken a superhuman level of restraint to keep my hands at my sides. Now I stood in the corner of the lavish country club ballroom, watching the reception unfold in a dizzying, opulent blur of crystal chandeliers and imported silk drapery. Trent had spared absolutely no expense using the phantom wealth he had siphoned from Apex Financial to build a breathtaking monument to his own towering ego. The enormous room was flooded with golden light and the melodic upbeat hum of a live jazz band. Madeline was floating gracefully across the polished mahogany dance floor. Her vintage lace veil removed her face glowing with the innocent radiance of a woman who firmly believed her magnificent life was just beginning. She laughed at something a bridesmaid whispered, completely oblivious to the dark gathering storm. It took every ounce of my formidable willpower to remain rooted to the shadows, leaning heavily on my wooden cane like a fragile, forgotten relic. I watched Trent holding court near the towering champagne fountain in the center of the room. He held a delicate crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon in his hand, laughing loudly, his chest puffed out proudly, like a conquering emperor surveying his newly acquired domain. He was drinking deeply intoxicated not just by the expensive alcohol, but by the absolute thrill of his perceived victory. In his sociopathic mind, he had completely won the game. He had secured the beautiful, trusting bride. He had secured the pristine real estate required for his cartel collateral. And he had secured the flawless, invisible alibi for a $5 million tragedy. But the grand ballroom held darker, infinitely more dangerous guests. My cold gaze drifted systematically through the celebrating crowd, expertly scanning the perimeter until my eyes locked firmly onto table 12. Seated at the shadowy edge of the room, far from the bustling dance floor and the joyous family tables, were three men who did not fit the elegant aesthetic of the evening. They wore expensive, tailored suits, but the fine Italian fabric could not hide the thick, predatory bulk of their frames or the hardened set of their jaws. They had been officially introduced on the seating chart as Trent's distant cousins visiting from out of state. I knew exactly who they really were. They were the Shadow Syndicate enforcers. They did not drink the champagne. They did not mingle with the other guests. They sat with rigid, terrifying stillness, their cold, reptilian eyes tracking Trent's every single move. They were waiting patiently for the absolute confirmation that the marriage certificate had been legally signed, witnessed, and officially filed. They were waiting to claim Madeline's house as their rightful collateral for a $4 million debt. Trent occasionally threw them a subtle, reassuring nod across the room, silently promising them that their massive payout would be settled momentarily. It was a sickening, terrifying pantomime of civilized behavior, masking a lethal reality. Just as the uniformed waiters began clearing the first course from the tables, the heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the ballroom swung open. Bradley Carmichael stepped into the radiant light of the reception hall. The chief executive officer of Apex Financial looked exactly like a man walking directly toward the gallows. His tailored tuxedo was impeccable, but his face was an ashen, sunken mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He clutched a small leather-bound folio in his trembling left hand, his knuckles stark white. He paused at the grand entrance, his panicked eyes darting frantically around the crowded room, until they finally found me standing quietly in the dim alcove near the terrace doors. I gave him a single imperceptible nod of absolute authority. He swallowed hard, visibly, forcing a stiff, agonizingly fake smile onto his sweaty face, and began to walk slowly toward the center of the room. He was following my direct, chilling order to the exact letter. He was waiting for my signal to drop the blade. Trent spotted Bradley almost instantly. The transformation in his demeanor was immediate, terrifying, and violently eager. The charming, attentive groom vanished in a heartbeat, completely replaced by a ruthless, greedy corporate climber, desperate for his massive payday. His dark eyes lit up with a ravenous, undeniable hunger. He saw Bradley Carmichael not as an esteemed wedding guest, but as the literal physical manifestation of his $2 million closing commission. Trent slammed his crystal champagne flute onto a passing waiter's silver tray, not caring that the expensive liquid splashed over the rim. He spun toward Madeline with frantic, erratic energy. He grabbed her upper arm. His grip was sudden, possessive, and entirely too tight. I saw a brief flash of confusion and slight, genuine pain cross my daughter's beautiful face as he jerked her abruptly away from a circle of her laughing bridesmaids. "Come with me right now," Trent hissed, his voice dropping its charming facade and carrying a sharp, ugly edge of command that he had never previously dared to use in my presence. "My boss just arrived from the city. We need to go greet him immediately. This is the moment, Maddie. This is the $2 million handshake that secures our entire future." He practically dragged her across the polished dance floor, his expensive leather shoes sliding smoothly over the mahogany planks. He was entirely focused on Bradley, his vision completely narrowed by profound greed. He was completely blind to the silent, invisible trap rapidly closing around his throat. I did not wait for him to cross the expansive room. I released my tight grip on the wooden cane, letting the prop clatter softly against the heavy velvet curtain behind me. The frail, pathetic old man vanished instantly into the shadows, discarded like a useless costume. I stepped out into the brilliant, sparkling light of the grand ballroom, moving with the silent, lethal grace of an apex predator, executing a calculated strike. I bypassed the crowded tables, ignoring the curious glances of the wedding guests. I crossed the floor in 10 rapid, purposeful strides and positioned myself exactly next to Bradley Carmichael. I stood shoulder to shoulder with the terrified executive, standing tall, radiating absolute dominance just as Trent Lawson and my bewildered daughter finally arrived before us. Trent stopped abruptly, his arrogant smile faltering slightly as his confused eyes darted from Bradley's ashen, sweating face to my cold, unyielding stare. He opened his mouth to speak, fully expecting to introduce his frail father-in-law to his powerful boss. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his feet had already vanished. The music continued to play, the guests continued to laugh, but in that small, isolated pocket of the grand ballroom, the air grew freezing cold. The game was over. The trap sprung. I looked directly into Trent's dark, greedy eyes, ready to destroy him. His initial flash of confusion lasted only a fraction of a second, before it was swallowed by his monstrous arrogance. He could not compute my presence next to his ultimate superior as anything other than a pathetic coincidence. To him, I was merely a confused old man who had accidentally stumbled into the inner circle of the corporate elite. He released a sharp, irritated breath, aggressively adjusting his silk tie as he physically stepped between myself and Bradley Carmichael. He used his broad shoulders to literally block me from view, treating me like an unsightly stain on the luxurious mahogany floor. Bradley Trent began, his voice immediately adopting a slick, nauseatingly smooth cadence that dripped with sycophantic desperation. "I am so incredibly honored that you could make it tonight. It means the absolute world to me to have the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Financial here to witness this milestone." He tightened his ruthless grip on her delicate arm, pulling her forward roughly, like a newly acquired piece of expensive property. He plastered a blinding artificial smile onto his face. "I want to introduce you to my beautiful bride, Madeline. She is the crown jewel of my entire existence." Madeline winced slightly, a subtle flinch that only a deeply observant father would ever notice. His grip was leaving faint red marks on her pale skin. She was entirely uncomfortable with his sudden, aggressive posturing, her gentle nature completely at odds with his ravenous corporate hunger. She offered Bradley a polite, hesitant smile, but she immediately pulled her arm out of his tightening grasp. She took a deliberate step backward, reaching out her hand to find my frayed sleeve. She was trying to ground herself, trying to bring her poor simple father back into the warmth of the conversation. "It is very nice to meet you, Mr. Carmichael," Madeline said softly, her voice carrying a quiet grace that cut through his suffocating ambition. She tugged gently on my arm, pulling me out from behind his imposing shadow and forcing me back into the brilliant light of the chandelier. "I would love to formally introduce you to my dad. He has been working so incredibly hard all week to help us prepare for this beautiful evening. He is the absolute best man I have ever known in my entire life, and I am so proud of him." Trent let out a sharp, audible hiss of absolute exasperation. He hated this. He despised the fact that his pristine high society illusion was being contaminated by my frayed cuffs and calloused hands. He rolled his dark eyes so violently, it was a wonder they did not permanently stick in the back of his skull. He let out a long, theatrical sigh, completely abandoning the charming groom persona. He leaned in intimately toward Bradley Carmichael, invading his personal space, adopting a conspiratorial man-to-man tone that was meant to establish a shared elite superiority between the two executives. "Bradley, please meet my tragically simple father-in-law," Trent said, his voice laced with a thick, venomous layer of pure contempt. He waved a dismissive hand in my direction without even bothering to look at my face. "He is an unemployed loser who spent his entire miserable life fixing leaking pipes and hammering nails. Just ignore him completely. He will not be around much longer anyway." The sheer chilling weight of those final 8 words slammed into the atmosphere like a physical wrecking ball echoing in my mind, with a dark, terrifying, and utterly murderous double meaning. Trent thought he was making a casual, dismissive joke about an old man facing impending transfer to a decrepit state-run psychiatric ward. He was silently referencing the ruthless, calculating plot to erase my mind with chemical restraints so he could secure his $5 million life insurance payout without any interference. He smiled a smug, devastatingly wicked smile, eagerly waiting for his powerful boss to chuckle and share in the cruel degradation of a social inferior. He waited for Bradley Carmichael to validate his monstrous arrogance, but the expected chuckle never arrived. The validation never materialized in the empty air. Instead, Bradley Carmichael froze completely solid. He looked as though he had just been struck by a massive bolt of invisible lightning. The remaining color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly translucent shade of chalky white. His eyes widened into massive pools of unadulterated primal terror. His entire body began to tremble violently beneath his tailored tuxedo. The champagne flute in his hand suddenly seemed entirely unimportant compared to the catastrophic reality crashing down upon the chief executive officer. Bradley realized exactly who Trent was insulting with such casual, reckless, and suicidal abandon. Bradley knew that Trent had just looked the silent founder of Pinnacle Holdings in the eyes and called him an unemployed loser. He knew that Trent had just insulted the billionaire titan holding the literal survival of Apex Financial in the palm of his calloused hand. His breathing turned into ragged, shallow gasps. He did not look at Trent. He could not even bear to glance at the foolish, doomed vice president standing beside him. Bradley kept his horrified, watering eyes locked entirely on my face, searching my cold, unforgiving expression for any microscopic sliver of undeserved corporate mercy. He found absolutely nothing but an endless ocean of freezing, calculating wrath. The ambient noise of the grand ballroom seemed to evaporate into an oppressive, heavy vacuum. The live jazz music, the clinking of crystal glasses, the joyful laughter of the wedding guests, it all faded into a distant, muted hum. The small circle we occupied became the absolute epicenter of the universe. Bradley Carmichael slowly, deliberately lowered his head. He bent his neck and dipped his shoulders, offering me a deep, trembling bow of absolute submission, profound respect, and desperate apology right in the middle of the dance floor. Trent stared at his boss in total stupefied bewilderment. His arrogant smile collapsed, melting off his face like wax sliding down a burning candle. He blinked rapidly, his mind desperately failing to process the bizarre, impossible scene unfolding before him. Why was the powerful chief executive officer of Apex Financial bowing to a broke, pathetic handyman? The gears in his sociopathic brain ground to a violent halt. Bradley Trent stammered, his voice suddenly sounding remarkably small and completely stripped of its previous aggressive bravado. "What are you doing? Why are you bowing to this useless old man?" Bradley Carmichael slowly straightened his posture. When he finally turned to look at Trent Lawson, the raw terror in his eyes had been completely replaced by a blazing, righteous fury. He looked at his senior vice president not as a promising protege, nor as a valuable asset, but as a deeply diseased, highly radioactive parasite that had nearly destroyed his entire life work. The silence surrounding us stretched so tight, it threatened to snap the very fabric of reality. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting calmly at my sides, watching the beautiful devastation finally begin to unfold. "You are completely fired, Trent," Bradley stated, his voice echoing loudly through the suddenly quiet hall. For a fraction of a second, the heavy words simply hung, suspended in the chilled air between us. Trent blinked, his perfectly groomed features contorting into a mask of complete and utter confusion. Then a low, awkward laugh sputtered from his throat. It was a pathetic, breathy sound, the nervous reaction of a man who desperately needed the universe to correct a sudden, glaring glitch in his reality. He reached out, attempting to playfully slap Bradley on the shoulder once again, but his hand hovered awkwardly in the empty space between them. "Bradley," he chuckled, his voice tight and unnaturally pitched. "That is a terrible joke. Seriously, you actually had me going for a second there. I thought you were actually upset about something. We are at my wedding reception, for goodness sake. Let us go get a drink and celebrate the pinnacle deal. I have the closing documents ready for Monday morning." Bradley did not move a single muscle. His eyes, completely devoid of their previous terror, were now burning with the righteous, unyielding fury of a man who had just narrowly escaped absolute corporate destruction. He reached inside his tailored tuxedo jacket and withdrew a thick, tightly bound stack of papers. It was the 50-page forensic audit I had transmitted to his secure terminal just 24 hours prior. With a sudden, violent motion, Bradley slammed the heavy document down onto the pristine white linen of the nearest champagne table. Crystal flutes rattled and tipped, spilling expensive vintage wine across the delicate fabric, but no one dared to breathe, let alone intervene. "There is no deal," Trent Bradley stated, his voice ringing with absolute lethal clarity. "That document is a zero-notice forensic audit authorized by the very people you thought you were manipulating. You did not secure our future. You actively engineered our ruin. You embezzled exactly $1.5 million from Apex Financial over the past 2 years. You created phantom vendor accounts. You siphoned our operating capital to pay off your own massive illicit debts. You are a thief, a parasite, and an absolute disgrace to the financial sector." Trent stared at the heavy stack of papers as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the table. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pallid gray. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled abruptly from the ocean. He tried to speak, to formulate a lie, to construct a defense, but the sheer crushing weight of the irrefutable truth paralyzed his tongue. "And that is not even your most catastrophic mistake," Bradley continued, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying register. "You just stood there, dripping with arrogant entitlement, and insulted the very man you claimed to be negotiating with." Bradley gestured respectfully in my direction, never breaking his furious eye contact with his former employee. "You told me to ignore your father-in-law. You called him an unemployed loser. Trent, you colossal fool. This man is not a simple handyman. He is Mr. Harrison. He is the sole founder and the majority shareholder of Pinnacle Holdings. He is my new boss, and he is the man who just systematically dismantled your entire miserable existence." The physical reaction was immediate and absolutely devastating. Trent staggered backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished mahogany dance floor. His knees visibly buckled completely, failing to support the sudden crushing weight of his shattered reality. He caught himself on the edge of the champagne table, his knuckles turning stark white as he desperately tried to remain upright. He slowly, agonizingly turned his head to look at me. The smug, victorious emperor was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified boy, staring directly into the eyes of a merciless god. I did not offer him a single ounce of pity. I released my posture, discarding the hunched, fragile persona I had meticulously maintained for months. I rolled my shoulders back, standing tall, and projecting the absolute suffocating authority of a man who had crushed international empires and dismantled billionaires. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. I watched the last remaining spark of hope extinguish in Trent's wide, panicked eyes. He finally realized the monumental lethal scale of his miscalculation. I stepped completely past him, ignoring his trembling presence, as if he were nothing more than a piece of discarded trash on the floor. I walked with slow, deliberate purpose toward the elevated stage where the string quartet had paused, and the disc jockey stood frozen in confusion. The entire grand ballroom had descended into a deathly suffocating silence. Hundreds of wealthy elite guests stood completely paralyzed, their champagne glasses suspended in midair, watching the surreal destruction unfold before them. I reached the stage and stepped up, my eyes locking onto the young, terrified disc jockey. "Cut the music immediately," I commanded, my voice carrying the absolute, unquestionable weight of a man who was accustomed to immediate obedience. "Give me the auxiliary connection for your primary sound system." The young man scrambled frantically, his hands shaking, as he handed me the heavy black cable connected directly to the towering array of amplifiers framing the dance floor. I pulled my secure cellular phone from the inner pocket of my frayed suit jacket. I plugged the cable into the device and accessed the encrypted audio folder containing the recordings from the military-grade bug hidden beneath Trent's office desk. I adjusted the master volume dial on the mixing board, pushing it to the absolute maximum limit. I looked out over the sea of frozen faces. My eyes bypassed the wealthy guests, the terrified corporate executives, and the silent, observing cartel enforcers sitting rigidly at table 12. I locked my gaze entirely on my beautiful daughter. Madeline stood alone in the center of the dance floor, clutching her bridal bouquet to her chest, her vintage veil trailing onto the floor. Her eyes were wide with profound confusion and mounting fear. I felt a sharp, agonizing stab of paternal heartbreak, but I knew this brutal surgery was absolutely necessary to save her life. "Listen very closely to the man you intended to marry," I said, my voice projecting clearly without the aid of a microphone. I pressed the digital play button on the screen. A sharp burst of static hissed through the massive speakers, immediately followed by the crisp, unmistakable, and utterly damning voice of Trent Lawson. His arrogant, cruel tone echoed off the crystal chandeliers, filling every single corner of the lavish reception hall. "As soon as Madeline and I sign the marriage certificate this weekend, my legal authority over her and her immediate family expands significantly," Trent's recorded voice boasted proudly. "The moment the house is legally transferred into my irrevocable property trust, I am tying up the final loose end. I have a remarkably unethical psychiatrist. He is going to officially evaluate the old man and sign a binding medical affidavit declaring him mentally unfit. Then I will arrange Madeline's unfortunate fatal allergic reaction for the life insurance. It is a perfectly clean sweep." The crowd gasped in absolute terror. Madeline's bouquet slipped, shattering the illusion. Before the final word was fully processed by the stunned crowd, the heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom burst completely open. A flood of heavily armed federal agents poured into the reception hall, their dark tactical gear striking a violent contrast against the pristine white decor. Leading the charge was Jonathan, his face an impenetrable mask of absolute authority as he raised his badge high into the sparkling light. "Nobody move," he commanded, his voice slicing through the chaos with practiced precision. The remaining illusion of Trent Lawson shattered instantly. The arrogant corporate climber finally realized there was no escape. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized his features. He spun on his expensive leather heels and lunged desperately toward the catering exit. He did not make it 3 steps. 2 agents intercepted him with brutal efficiency. They slammed him violently onto a nearby table, sending a cascade of crystal champagne flutes crashing to the floor. The sharp, metallic click of heavy handcuffs snapping shut echoed over his frantic, breathless protests. Simultaneously, the shadows around table 12 erupted into sudden motion. The undercover operatives I had positioned specifically for this moment abandoned their disguises. They tackled the 3 cartel enforcers, before the syndicate men could even reach inside their tailored jackets. Tables overturned and silverware scattered across the mahogany floor as the dangerous predators were swiftly neutralized and pinned securely to the ground. The threat was entirely eliminated in a matter of seconds. Trent was dragged toward the main exit, his polished veneer completely gone. He was screaming wildly, thrashing against the unyielding grip of the federal agents, spewing desperate lies and pathetic excuses that no one cared to hear. His tailored suit was torn, his perfect hair ruined. The entire hall watched his complete degradation in a state of absolute paralyzed awe. The doors slammed shut behind him, leaving a profound, echoing silence in the wake of the sudden hurricane. I took a deep, steadying breath, allowing the fierce adrenaline to slowly drain from my veins. The war was officially over. I turned my attention back to the center of the room. Madeline stood completely frozen, trembling violently, staring at the empty space where her deceitful fiancé had just been restrained. The delicate bridal bouquet lay discarded and crushed on the polished wood beneath her feet. She did not shed a single tear for a ruined wedding ceremony or a broken romance. She wept in absolute paralyzing shock, her body shaking uncontrollably as the horrifying, undeniable reality of the monster she had almost married fully settled into her exhausted mind. The heavy weight of his betrayal crushed her remaining strength. She collapsed forward, her knees giving out completely. I stepped forward rapidly and caught her immediately, wrapping my strong arms tightly around her trembling frame. I pulled her safely close to my chest, burying her face securely in my shoulder as she sobbed. "You are completely safe now, my beautiful darling," I whispered softly into her hair, my voice steady, comforting, and entirely unwavering. "I promise you he will never be able to hurt you again." I held her firmly until the violent shaking finally began to subside. I gently kissed her forehead, offering a silent vow of eternal protection. Then I turned to face the hundreds of wealthy, bewildered guests staring at us in absolute silence. The string quartet was completely mute. The catering staff remained frozen by the walls, unsure of what to do. I reached over to the closest intact catering table, carefully picking up a single flute of untouched, expensive champagne. I stood incredibly tall, projecting the absolute power of my true identity. I raised the crystal glass high into the bright golden light. "The wedding is permanently canceled," I declared, my voice resonating with absolute, unapologetic authority. "But the food is already fully paid for. Drink up, everyone. We are celebrating my daughter's brilliant survival." The greatest deception in life is not a lie told directly to your face, but the perfect mask someone wears while holding your hand. True predators do not lurk in dark alleys. They sit comfortably at our dinner tables, wrapped in designer suits and armed with highly plausible excuses. Never silence the quiet, persistent alarm bells of your own intuition, just to maintain a fragile peace. As a protective father, I learned that love is not merely about providing comfort. It is about being ruthless enough to step into the abyss and tear the hidden monsters apart to save them. Have you ever trusted someone completely only to uncover a chilling secret they were hiding? How did your gut feeling save you from a massive disaster? Share your unique story in the comments below. Subscribe for more thrilling life lessons and hit the like button if intuition never truly lies.